They came after the Neanderthals and took over the land. They spread across the plains and into the mountains, following the herds of horses, woolly rhinos, mammoths. They fed their families while predators watched from the shadows. The Aurignacians, hunters, gatherers, survivors. But the land was changing. What once was grass, it turned to ice, and their old ways couldn't keep up. The migration routes that fed them for generations were now desolate. Starvation waited, patient, for those who didn't adapt. But they were clever, resourceful, new tools, new tactics. They figured out, found a way to live in a world that wanted them dead. This was the Upper Paleolithic, a time when everything shifted. In Europe, this age of innovation is where we know our ancestors best. This is the story of the Gravettians, the second chapter in the world shaped by ice, hunger, and survival. This is the Immortal Art Podcast. I'm your host, Eldin. Episode 59, Art Legacy of the Tall Hunters, the Gravettians. If you like this podcast, you can support it for little as $1 per month. You can get early access to the episode up to 24 hours. You can donate one time or longer. It's up to you. The links are below. Check them out. Subscribe and follow. You can reach me at immortalartpodcast@gmail.com. You can rate and leave a comment. Thank you. They first uncovered the Gravettian culture at the site called La Gravette in southern France, in Dordogne. They found buried tools, points, and worked bone, things that haven't been seen before. The projectiles were well made, sharper, different from what lay in the older layers of the earth. What started at La Gravette wasn't just a local discovery. These tools, they were all over the continent, a defining mark of the people we would come to know as the Gravettians. A culture that stretched far and wide, one that surprised us with its sophistication. They created art. They lived with more complexity than we ever expected. It all started about 33,000 years ago and carried on until 22,000 years ago, at the end of the Aurignacians, who had adapted their lands, and especially in the south and west, had to go through another change in Europe. It was getting colder and drier. By 33,000 years ago, their numbers and reach began to shrink. The Gravettian culture emerged during this time, though exactly where is still debated. One theory suggests an origin in the Middle Danube basin, where early Gravettian tools appeared at sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic and in Willendorf in Austria. From there, the technology spread across Europe, from Poland to France, down to the Iberian Peninsula, and east toward the Russian plain. Another theory argues for multiple independent origins, with the Gravettian centers evolving separately from earlier tradition in different regions. Most likely, both ideas are true. Eastern and Central Europe may have been the single origin point, while in the West, older cultures weren't simply replaced, they evolved. Genetic studies also shed light on the Gravettians. DNA from the individuals at Dolní Věstonice showed them as a mix of Eastern and Western European lineages. This shift in population genetics, along with the archaeological record, was likely driven by the harsh climate as Europe entered its coldest phase. The Aurignacian culture held on its isolated pockets, but by the 30 to 35,000 years ago, the Gravettians has mostly taken over. Gravettian people were tall and relatively slender. men stood 179 to 188 centimeters tall on average, which is exceptionally tall for prehistoric times. Interestingly, you can still see traces of this height in populations today. Men from Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia are some of the tallest men in Europe, averaging between 178 to 188 centimeters tall. Researchers link this trait, in part, to the parental haplogroup LM70, which traces back to Gravettian population. About 20% of European men carry this genetic legacy. Gravettian women, on the other hand, they were much shorter, averaging just 160 to 164 centimeters, making the difference between men and women nearly 16%, far greater than the modern average of around 7%. It's not clear why the difference existed, but some believe it had to do with hunting or sexual selection. Despite their height, Gravettian men weighed between 67 and 73 kilograms, while Gravettian women weighed around 54 kilograms. We have to remember they lived highly physical lives with much more muscle mass than most of us today. Facially, Gravettians shared high cheekbones, a feature that persisted from the Aborigines. Their skin was likely dark than any modern European population. Think of the brown olives. They lacked the genes for the lighter pigmentation, which only developed in the past 19 to 11,000 years ago. Their culture, after emerging quickly, spread across Europe, replacing some dying Aborigine groups. Long-distance trade, yes, trade, you heard me right, allowed their innovations and cultural ideas to move across the continent, giving the Gravettians a more unified cultural identity than their predecessors. In the time of Aborigines, the whole population of Western and Central Europe was about 150,000 people. That's nothing, barely a village by today's standards. Imagine the whole Europe today, with around 800 million people, and now 1,500 people spread across the whole continent. But when the Gravettians showed up, the numbers grow around 3,000 people. Still, in a place as big as Europe, 3,000 people might as well be none at all. This happened as the world got colder. Places like Swabia in Germany and Dordogne in France, once sparsely populated, saw new life. Even places untouched before, northern France, Iberia, the Carpathians, they were now home to these wandering groups of people. To understand the Gravettian environment, I will talk about glacial periods. Right now, we are now in the interglacial warm period. But the last ice age, which ended roughly 11,500 years ago, began around 120,000 years back. The glaciers reached the peak between 26 and 20,000 years ago. During the Aborigine culture, Europe was relatively warm for an ice age. But as conditions worsened, Gravettians emerged between 35 and 30,000 years ago, thriving in the cold. Things grew harsher during the last glacial maximum, affecting not just survival, but reshaping the land. When glaciers grew, sea level dropped, exposing more land. The English Channel was just a river, and what is now the Adriatic Sea was mostly dry land. Yet, while new land had appeared, glaciers buried places like the Alps, the British Isles, and all of the Scandinavia. Central and Western Europe became a cold, dry, steppe tundra, open, barren, and relentlessly unforgiving. Because of these harsh conditions, the Gravettian culture was actually quite diverse. When I say Gravettian culture, I'm really thinking about their tool industry. A tool industry represents the unique tools that define a culture. The Gravettian tools were distinct, standing apart from those of the Aurignacian before them or the Solitarian that followed. But the term Gravettian is broad. Within it, there were variations based on geography, time, and specific tool styles. The Gravettian culture of Upper Paleolithic employed sophisticated technologies and tools, building upon methods from earlier periods like the Aurignacian. But they didn't know, how could they, that their flint knapping was old for millions of years. The Gravettian use of blade core technology, particularly through the production of long blades and smaller microlights, heightened their adaptability and innovation. These microlights, small stone tools, often hefted in the composite tools, were versatile and could be easily replaced when worn. This efficiency was vital in creating multi-purpose tools such as knives, projectiles, and even more complex weapons such as atlatl darts. Gravettian points, specifically backed blades, were a signature element of this culture. These blades had a sharp edge on one side and a blunt edge on the other. This indicates that the Gravettian skill in crafting weapons could penetrate medium and large game, a crucial adaptation for survival. Gravettian created larger points which could have served various functions from hunting to butchery, much like multi-purpose tools of other ancient cultures. These points are thought to have been used with the atlatl, a spear-throwing device, which allowed hunters to throw projectiles with greater speed and force. Evidence from Belgium suggests that atlatl was in use as far back as 31,000 years ago. This technology, like the bow and arrow, gave Gravettian hunters a significant advantage in hunting large and fast-moving game. The Gravettians used stone tools for processing hides, work bone, and make complex clothing. Scrapers and burins were common, with the scraper used for cleaning hides and burins for shaping bone. Eye bone needle, punch tools, and smoothers show they made advanced clothing by puncturing, sewing, and softening hides. Another remarkable technological innovation of the Gravettians was their early use of ceramics. Their ceramics were not used for purposes like later pottery. They demonstrate an impressive level of skill as they were fired in ovens or kilns at a temperature between 500 and 800 degrees Celsius. This predates the earliest known ceramics in China by almost 10,000 years. The subculture of Pavlovian ceramics were more symbolic, often made into figurines. The Gravettians used stone drills, which were likely used in creating holes for beads, jewelry, and tools such as batons. Finally, there is evidence that the Gravettians may have begun domesticating wolves. Remains of dog-like canids have been found at the Gravettian sites at Konstanki in Russia and Predmosty in Czech Republic, suggesting that dogs may have played a role in hunting, protection, and even transportation. Gravettian people living near coastal areas relied heavily on marine resources. In these regions, around 20 to 30% of their diet came from shellfish and fish. Seals were favored along the Atlantic coast. However, not all coastal Gravettians embraced seafood. Some populations in Iberia, for example, hardly consumed any, preferring terrestrial food. This is especially intriguing given that even Neanderthals in Iberia consumed significant amounts of shellfish. What happened there? I imagine that was forbidden food or food of the others. I don't know why. Anyway, beyond their hunting skills, Gravettians were really good gatherers. Though plant remains are harder to trace, Chemical analysis of their bones showed that plants were an important part of their diet. Even those regularly eating mammoths consumed a fair share of plants. Plants have been crucial to their seasonal intake. One of the most fascinating discoveries is evidence of flour production. In Italy, Gravettians ground the acorns into flour, and across Europe, other seeds were similarly processed. Grinding stones found in domestication point to regular flour production, likely turned into simple bread or some kind of a cereal. Processing plants in this way made them easier to digest and significantly increased the energy they provided. Through their flour making might suggest early agricultural practices, the cold climate during the Gravettian era ruled out true agriculture. Despite this, their diverse diet allowed them to extract more resources from the environment than their predecessors, contributing to larger, more sustained population compared to the Aurignacian or Neanderthals. Surviving the last glacial period required more just food and fire. It also demanded well-isolated shelters. Unlike the Aurignacians, who could rely on simpler outdoor camps during warmer periods, the Gravettians faced a much colder climate. While they used caves and rock shelters, they were often insufficient, leading to the creation of more complex structures. In Central Europe, particularly in Moravia, in modern-day Czech Republic, the Gravettian groups known as Pavlovians developed some of the most intricate shelters of Upper Paleolithic. These mammoth hunters constructed shelters using mammoth bones, crafting massive, sturdy shelters. Sites like Pavlov and Dolní Bestonice, near the Scandinavian ice sheet, revealed that these shelters were essential for enduring the harsh steppe tundra. Mammoth bones, tusks, ribs, jaws formed the framework, likely covered by large hides. Storage pits filled with tools, artistic materials like red ochre, and most likely food surrounded these structures. One notable site, Predmosty in Czech Republic, contains the remains around 1,000 mammoths, predominantly young females. These shelters and the abundance of food from mammoth hunting allow the subcultures of Gravettians, called Pavlovonians, to remain semi-nomadic during the harsh winters, a rare luxury in the Paleolithic. In Austria, 26 to 27,000 years ago, two infants were buried together at Krems-Wachtenberg, both around 9 to 10 months old. They were laid side by side, covered in ochre, and placed under a mammoth scapula supported by a tusk. Ivory beads adorned the burial. The third child, not older than 3 months, was buried separately nearby, wrapped in ochre-stained shroud, secured by a mammoth ivory pin. Such graves tells a story of profound grief and rituals. In Sankir, in Russia, two children, buried head-to-head, shared grave goods as extravagant as they were puzzling. Thousands of ivory beads, mammoth spears, and delicate figurines. The beads alone require estimated 10,000 hours to craft. These people cared about their dead, and they cared about these children. We are not different from these people, only technology and culture change. We would feel the same sorrow, we would feel the same joy. If we would meet these people on the street, they would be as anybody else around us. Perhaps the grief of losing these children led to the people to invest time and effort into these intricate burials, a means to cope. But not all were treated with such reverence. Elsewhere, burial was a rarity. Sometimes bodies were left to the elements. Yet, In places like Wales and Portugal, burials with elaborate details such as shells, ivory rings, animal offerings spoke to a shared culture of mourning and reverence. The remains tell a story of a time long past, but the loss, the ritual, and the attempts to find meaning are timeless. The Gravettians, as we today, were part of the world that saw purpose in life amidst the harsh reality of existence. Towards the end of the Gravettian times, the world was getting colder, much colder than before. These people had lived through hard times, but little did they know they were nearing the last glacial maximum, the coldest phase of the last ice age, around 24,000 years ago. The sun dimmed, the earth cooled, and food grew scarce. Northern Europe became almost uninhabitable. Population plummeted, shrinking by 60%. From Britain to southern Germany, the once thriving Gravettian camps vanished. Life didn't get any easier further south. Places in Cantabria and the southern East Europe, people held on. While the north froze, those southern communities dealt with different challenges. They had a lot of rain rather than cold. These once thriving civilizations in northern Europe crumbled, but small populations survived in these southern refuge. In these southern pockets, the isolation broke apart the intricate social networks that once spanned vast distances. Communities shrunk, cut off from each other, becoming more regional, more isolated. Cultural complexity faded as people focused on survival. Yet, even in these harshest of times, humans endured. The Gravettian culture, through weekend, gave rise to new groups. In East, they became the Epigravettian people, while in the West, the Solitarian culture emerged. These cultures held onto some Gravettian traditions, but each adapted to their changing world. The Gravettian era was a time of survival against impossible odds. Despite the harshness, they were resilient, thriving for thousands of years. Their legacy, not just in tools and symbolic art they left behind, but in the fact that they lived, survived, and passed on their innovations. Their story is still with us. In the next episode, I will talk about Solitarian and Epigravettian cultures with the Magdalenian period, the final chapter of Europe's Upper Paleolithic story. Then I will speak about every single cave and the cave art. This concludes this episode. I want to thank you for joining and listening. I hope I inspired you. I hope you learned something. The music is performed by my friend Sebastian. You can check his band Cadavra. There is a link below. Enjoy the song. Until the next time. Goodbye.